Venezuela 101.
We wish to inform our listeners that for the production of this episode, the voices have been dubbed from Spanish to English using artificial intelligence.
Hello everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Venezuela 101. I'm Melanio Escobar, and as always, I'm joined by Miguel Pizarro. Today, we want to catch up on what's been happening in our country since our last episode. We are now a month away from the presidential elections, and many things have happened that we think are important to share with you.
That's right, Melanio. We want to make it clear that we are recording this episode on September 2nd in the afternoon. So everything we mention is up to date as of this moment. In the past few weeks, we have seen how the situation in Venezuela has worsened. Repression and social control have escalated, which is why we're doing this episode as an update for all our listeners. Let's begin.
As you said, Miguel, Venezuela is currently experiencing one of the largest waves of repression in its recent history. According to official figures, since July 28th, more than 2,000 people have been arbitrarily detained by the regime, and as of now, 1,780 of these cases have been confirmed by civil society organizations. Among them are 230 women and 114 teenagers. These are people who simply protested against electoral fraud. Human rights defenders, political leaders, journalists, many of whom are being transferred to prisons along with common criminals, such as Yar 3rd, Tocuyito, and Tocoron, which are in deplorable conditions, like overcrowding and lack of access to basic services.
Not only that, Melanio, approximately 25 people have been killed in the context of the protests that erupted after July 28th. Entire families have been subjected to violence by the regime's repression. On top of that, forced disappearances have been used as a tactic by the regime. For example, Freddy Superlano, a political leader, was intercepted by the regime's security forces on July 30th, and a month later, his family still has no news of his whereabouts. And something similar happened with journalist Roland Carreño, who has been missing since August 2nd, and the list goes on. To this day, we know nothing about Williams Davila, Perkins Rocha, or Biagio Pilieri, all political leaders who have been silenced in the same way in recent days.
This repression doesn't stop with politicians. The press has also been targeted. In the electoral context, 16 journalists, photojournalists, and editors of news portals have been arbitrarily detained. 4 of them have been released, but 13 remain in custody. NGOs, activists, and human rights defenders have also been forcefully targeted. For example, Rocio San Miguel has now been missing for 6 months since she was kidnapped, disappeared, and then sentenced by the regime. This past month, Nelida Sanchez, the training coordinator for the civil organization Sumate, was also arbitrarily detained. Organizations report that the detainees are denied the right to private legal defense and are kept isolated and without communication until they are brought before the courts.
This repression and harassment, Melanio, even extend beyond the country's borders. Activists, journalists, and influential figures in the arts have seen their passports annulled simply for showing support for opposition leader Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia. Other citizens at random have also had their passports canceled without any justification. This shows how the regime continues to shrink civic and democratic space in Venezuela, turning any act of dissent into a reason for harassment, kidnapping, disappearance, or cruel and inhumane treatment.
In addition to this, on August 24th, Attorney General Tarek William Saab announced that the public ministry had summoned opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia, accusing him of conspiracy and other charges related to the denunciation of electoral fraud. After 3 summonses, which are part of the regime's strategy to intimidate and harass the opposition and its leaders, the candidate now faces the possibility of the regime ordering his arrest. Maria Corina Machado had already stated that Gonzalez Urrutia would not comply with the summons, as he is in hiding, and denounced the totalitarian situation in Venezuela, warning of threats not only of arrest, but also of a possible raid on Gonzalez Urrutia's home.
On top of all this, we have the chaos caused by the regime with its electoral fraud. A month after the presidential elections, the National Electoral Council has yet to publish the official documents supporting the results they announced. That's why the international community has been very clear in not recognizing the result provided by the CNE. Various countries and leaders have refused to accept results without proof, without records, without results from voting stations. And the regime, instead of providing these proofs, instead of presenting the results or anything to substantiate them, filed a motion with the Supreme Court, which is controlled by them, and ended up certifying and validating the fraud announced by the National Electoral Council. However, we cannot forget that both the Supreme Court of Justice and the electoral body have been pointed out by the UN fact-finding mission as institutions without any impartiality or independence, acting as part of the state's repressive machinery under the orders of the executive.
That's right, Miguel. Speaking of the UN, it's also important to highlight the role of the UN panel of experts who participated as election observers. This panel published its preliminary report, in which it states that the CNE's handling of the results did not meet the basic transparency and integrity measures essential for credible elections. This is not an isolated opinion. It is a complaint supported by experts and international organizations closely following the situation.
Alongside this repression and the regime's actions, we have also seen how Venezuelans, both inside and outside the country, continue to protest against the electoral fraud. We all demand that the regime allows an audit and verification of the results, but above all, we all demand that the regime accept its defeat. International observers have also supported these demands, concluding that the electoral process lacked basic transparency guarantees.
Indeed, as expected, the international community has reacted to all this. The OAS General Secretariat has strongly rejected the Supreme Court's ruling that certifies the electoral results, pointing out that the CNE proclaimed Maduro based on a partial bulletin without detailed results, which contrasts with the transparency shown by the opposition in publishing the official records. Additionally, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and its special rapporteur for freedom of expression have condemned the practices of repression and political persecution in Venezuela, even referring to state terrorism.
The European Union has also been clear in its stance. Josep Borrell, the High Representative for Foreign Affairs, has declared that the EU will not recognize Maduro as president until the electoral records are provided. Furthermore, countries across the region have expressed their rejection of the so-called verification of the results by the Supreme Court and the repression and human rights violations in the country. For our part, Venezuelans have expressed our deep gratitude to the international community for supporting the fight for democracy in our country, and especially for not abandoning us in such a crucial moment in our history.
As if that weren't enough, Miguel, the crisis in the country continues to deepen. On August 30th, Venezuela suffered a nationwide blackout that left 80% of the country in darkness from the early morning until the afternoon in some regions. This blackout not only left a large part of the country without electricity, but also affected internet connectivity, phone service, and even public transportation, adding more chaos to the already complicated daily life of Venezuelans. In fact, as we record this episode, some areas still remain without power or connectivity.
What we're seeing is a combination of brutal repression, electoral fraud, social crisis, and an economic crisis that continues to deepen as the regime remains in power. But it's also important to highlight that despite all this, Venezuelans, along with the international community, continue to fight, demanding justice, transparency, and that the people's sovereignty be respected.
That's right, Miguel. To our audience, we apologize for interrupting the closing of this episode on the situation in Venezuela, but something very important happened as we were finishing recording.
Just minutes ago, the court with jurisdiction over terrorism, corruption, and organized crime has issued an arrest warrant against the president-elect Edmundo González Urrutia. This follows a request made by an assistant prosecutor of the public ministry. This event marks a turning point in our Republican history and the will expressed by millions of Venezuelans on July 28th.
For our part, we will continue to document and process what happens as this new event unfolds, which further jeopardizes the recovery of democracy in our country. For now, we say goodbye.
This was Venezuela 101.
In addition to our personal accounts at Miguel Pizarro and at Melanio Bar, you can also follow us on Instagram as @Venezuela101_.
Remember, you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube.
Venezuela 101.